You know, back in the old days of internet reviews, there was an anime group called the Desu Des Brigade. Their members were Vix, who used to review hentai, Glass Reflections, who's still around, Professor Taku, and Jacob Chapman. They used to do anime together. They used to do good reviews. And I mean good ones, not what you think Bennett does. For the longest time, they had a running gag that says only real men watch Princess Tutu. For the longest time, I thought that was just a gag because of how cute it looked. Then I watched the entire series last year. And they're right. Only real men watch it. It is awesome. It is great. It's got a lot of in-depth meaning. It's a great story, well told, well animated, and it's got some of his favorite voice actors. Thank you, Trix. So, of course, I'm going to spread the love by talking about a good fanfic like that. So, here is one from fanfiction.net. This Pendant Heart by lunasphere. Let's see, author's note. So it took 3 years, but the strike's finally over. If it wasn't for Monica's Chan's beta? A beta? Somebody actually remembered that betas exist in the fanfiction world? Stop the presses! Once upon a time, there was a poet who tried to drink his sorrow, hoping that if he contained it in, it could not drown him. He watched the moon as it sifted petal by petal like a swollen rose on the lake. The universe lay at his feet, and watched the stars dance on the waves of space, as lights did on the water. Stars in space did not matter. To embrace the moon, he thought he reached with eyes open. He could not hold it. That moon, as the soft and formless water, it swallowed him, and he died by trying to grasp the beauty of the moon. He felt only a drowning embrace. Fakir was miserable, because Duck was not. No, he had no illusions about himself. He knew he was a selfless bastard. He was not selfless enough to be content in their contentment, to find comfort in the fact that she was taking her reversion back into a duck so well. It was all well and good for the prince and princess to leave behind Hunter reality, for the townspeople, who hadn't even been deeply mired in Drosselmeyer's The Prince and the Raven, to forget the entire nightmare. The burden of memory had been bearable at first, because he knew he wasn't alone. Duck, too, shouldered it with him. But that, too, had changed. When Duck first returned to being a duck, of course Fakir had grieved at losing the lively red-haired girls he had been. But she had been and would always be the one who healed him, who had saved him all. Girl, Duck, it didn't matter, he told himself, and believed it, except sometimes in the darkest hours of night, as he slumbered in the nest of blankets and he stared mindlessly at his ceiling, haunted by the memories of the girls he had been, the carefree laughter, the awkward grace, and always that unceasing chatter. But she was still Duck, and he could live with things the way they were now, he told himself firmly, even as his heart ached because with each passing day, those memories of her became slightly hazier, paler, and then somehow, as if his own troubled thoughts had woken her, she would quack sleepily, inquiringly from her own makeshift nest, and he would grouse at her just to go back to sleep. But he would still feel his heart eased, his own worries soothed. She was still Duck, and nothing in the world could change that. Of course, he stayed beside her as he had promised, and they happily spent endless hours in each other's company. He made certain the bathtub was always full of water so she could swim around if she felt the need, and kept his pockets perpetually stocked with bread. She sat in a little basket lined with soft blanket on his desk, and would peer over his arm as he worked at the stories Drosselmeyer had left unfinished or hopelessly tangled. They took walks together, Fakir slowing his pace to match Duck's slow waddling, and often in the evenings he read aloud to her while he had tried to find in other novels, books, and poems hints of the art of writing so he could improve his own attempts at fixing Drosselmeyer's foolishness. Fakir didn't have much experience with writing, let alone with spinning tales into reality, so finishing the stories was slow, tedious work. As often as not, what he wrote didn't change reality at all. Through trial and error, he learned that spinning tales had as much to do with emotion and attention he put into the piece of writing as he did with the quality of work. Naturally, starting writing reflecting that he hadn't spent much time on it. And if he didn't spend much time on it, he wouldn't have had much of his attention or desire for it to become real in it. He soon realized he needed to learn how to write as well, and to do so, he even stopped attending the Goldcrown Academy for Fine Arts. He had a new goal in his life, and dance didn't seem to fit into it. Besides, it took away from the time he could spend with Duck, since pets were not allowed in the building. An ironic injunction, considering that the previous instructor and the accompanist had both been animals, but of course no one remembered that. In short, for those first few months after she had transformed back into a duck, the two were inseparable. Of course, she couldn't communicate with him directly, but intelligence and understanding shone in her eyes when he talked to her, and often she would quack heartily, or nod, or shake her head in response to what he said. Granted, it was only one half of communication. She could understand everything he said, and could understand only a fraction of the things she wanted to convey. But, well, he could live with that if she could, and just living was enough. Sharon had slowly grown accustomed to his son's affection for his new pet. He couldn't understand why the little duck had meant so much to the boy. But if it was one of the few things that could make Fakir happy, Sharon wasn't going to object. Of course, Sharon had been upset when Fakir dropped out of school for no reason, but couldn't get the boy to budge on that point at all. Every time he tried, the boy just struck out Sharon's words before he could even really begin. To abandon ballet so suddenly after years of training and hard work, it made no sense to Sharon. He couldn't figure out what drove Fakir anymore. Maybe he was just at that age. But in the face of Fakir's stubbornness, Sharon decided to let things be for the time being. It was clear that Fakir wasn't merely lazing around the house. He was deeply involved in some project and spent an enormous amount of money on books. As long as Fakir was trying to do something with his life, Sharon found that he didn't mind much, for the time being. As weeks turned to months and months to nearly a year, Fakir had finally begun to notice a change so gradual in Duck's behavior that at first he dismissed it as his imagination. But as time passed, there was no denying that she responded less and less to his words, until one day, well into winter, he noticed that she didn't nod or shake his head at his comments anymore. He had come home in a foul mood, stomping into his room, tossing the books that he carried into his bed. How could anyone else possibly need a centuries-old book on rhetoric? Fakir demanded angrily as Duck scurried out of his way in his frantic pacing. The damned fool who checked it out probably doesn't even know how to read. How am I supposed to finish that story without it? I don't even know what I... He grumbled over Duck's furious squawking, having been ceremoniously startled. A quiet afternoon turned to chaos. As she continued her quacking, upbraiding of him, he could not shake the feeling she was responding only to the anger in his voice, as an animal understood human emotion from the tone, rather than the content of what being said. The awful suspicion that she had lost the ability to understand human speech began to seep into his mind. He stopped mid-stride, mid-sentence, the rant, the book, the story forgotten. His hands fell limply to his sides, useless, powerless as anger gave way to a sudden, awful fear that seemed to erase all his thoughts. But the little duck merely fluttered her wings in lingering irritation at him, settling into her basket as if nothing were wrong at all. Somehow her unconcern, that casual preening of her feathers, snapped him back to himself a little. The overwhelming dread that had threatened to consume him settled into an unconquerable stone in the pit of his stomach. He forced himself to face her, to say in as steady a voice as he could, I know that sounds stupid, Duck, but I need you to nod your head if you understand what I'm saying. The duck merely tilted her head to the side curiously. It peered about before continuing turning to preening. The stone of dread grew heavier. "This is serious, you idiot!" The anger rose in his voice. "Nod your head if you can understand me!" The duck quacked sharply and waddled out of her basket with a huff of annoyance. The growing desperation, Fakir called to her retreating yellow form. "Duck! Stop! Duck! Please, just stop and turn around if you understand what I'm saying. I'm begging you." But despite the pleading edge in his voice, the duck merely continued on her way out of the room without once looking back. Duck waddled away sadly from the loud human whose yelling was starting to hurt her ears. She knew he was only making all that noise because he was in some sort of terrible pain, but she couldn't for the life of her understand why. He didn't look like he was injured. She didn't see any blood or anything. He wanted something, she thought, the way his cries were filled with pain and desperation. And despair. Yes, that was it. Despair. But she didn't know how to help him because she couldn't even see what had hurt him. She could not stand the sight of him in such pain, though. All she could do was waddle away and try to fetch the other older human who lived here. After all, the man had probably a better idea of what was wrong since he could understand the little boy, and that would help. The little yellow duck looked all over the house, but it seemed that the man wasn't anywhere to be found. At last she decided to return to the room where she had heard her sounding human, although she couldn't really understand why. She felt that she should know him, that she should feel like she had known him forever. Then there was a deep bond between them, forged slowly and painfully, one she could not bear to lose. She found his room a war zone on her return. Papers were scattered everywhere, books laid on the floor, tossed aside as useless as what looked like the remains of an inkstand, and ink pulled on the floor in one corner. The duck feather quill he always wrote with lay perfectly untouched and unharmed on the desk, as it always did when he wasn't using it. His back was to her as he sat in the bay window, looking outside. For some reason, she was stuck with the thought that he was a knight. Her knight. That sounded much better than her human. She puzzled over the strange word, not entirely sure what it meant or why she thought it belonged to him. But the word, like the boy before her, gave her a feeling of strength, of protection, of kindness, and her knight seemed to fit him so perfectly she couldn't even think of him any other way. And yet he hunts there before the window. There was nothing particularly strong or protective or even kind about his posture, only a sort of brokenness in every line. Even so, somehow she knew all those things would break himself to be all of them. Again, Duck had the nagging feeling that she, for now, for weeks, even months, had been forgetting something important. Something that meant all the world to her. But it happened so long ago. She should know more about him than the mere fact that he was the human who took care of her and fed her. She should be able to remember that he was much more to her than that. But no matter how hard she tried, the thought slipped away, shapeless, formless, like mist on a lake. On waddling closer to him, Duck could see the silent track of tears running down his face as he gazed mindlessly at his faint reflection in the glass. That expression, too, the tears, the slump of defeat in his shoulders, gave her the same uneasy feeling, as if she had seen this before, as if she should remember something. She wished she could help him, that she could ease his suffering, whatever caused it. But all she could do was give a little fluttering hop into the sea of the bay window, then onto his lap. Duck looked down, her blue eyes brimming with compassion, and tried to offer him all the comfort she could. Fakir gazed down at the little duck that had somehow found her way into his arms, was looking up at him with worried tears welling in her eyes. He was reminded of the moment when he had gone to the small pond by the smithy, with his despair at failing to protect the prince, being found unworthy of Longcran's sword by Charon. She had seen him at his worst, seen him when he couldn't have sunk any lower, and never thought less of him for the weakness. "You're seeing me in a worthless state," he whispered, echoing his words from back then. He was jabbing at a wound to feel at the pain, for even as he said the words, he knew Duck would most likely neither remembered or understood what he had just said to her. In her absence, after his pleas for her to return had failed, he had called long enough to try and figure out what had happened. The answer that came to him was as simple as it was sinister. She had transformed back into a duck when she gave the last shard Princess' heart, and ever since then she must have been in the process of turning back into a duck entirely. Animals, after all, even the most intelligent ones, couldn't understand the intricacies of human speech, could only grasp a small fragment of it, and ducks, most likely, didn't have much call for long-term memory in the same way humans did either. All the complex memories she had formed as Princess Tutu and Duck must have slowly been fading from her mind until only the most basic and simple ones remained. It was all painfully clear in hindsight. He remembered how, soon after she returned to being a duck, they would walk to her pond. He would on occasion dance on the shore as she swam, and every time she would leave the water to join him. Somehow she managed to pirouette even on her webbed feet, and every time he was left in nothing but awe and admiration of her grace. Even when she had been turned to human, those words could only apply to Princess Tutu's ballet, never to Duck's. But he could not remember the last time they had danced together. The last few times she had merely swum nearby, watching him with interest, but not coming towards the shore. At the time, he had thought that perhaps she was merely tired, or maybe even losing her interest in ballet. He certainly was, and it had been half a year since he had attended the academy. There was no longer the pressing need to practice hours on end each day to keep up his form. Since he was participating less and less often, he had let their impromptu pas de deux lapse without thought as to what it meant to Duck, who had absorbed ballet with her heart for as long as he had known her, no longer wanted to dance. How could he have failed to notice that all the skills she had learned as a girl were disappearing? How? How could he have failed her? He should have noticed. Should have done something before it was too late. Before, and the truth stuck him like a physical blow. She wasn't a duck any longer, but rather merely a duck. Her humanity had faded away. That was when he'd taken his rage out on his books and writing. It was all worthless. Everything was worthless if Duck too had forgotten their battle with the Raven, their struggles, their despair, and their hope. And she had forgotten him, even lost her. He stormed at the unfairness of a life which was destined him for nothing but loss. Would there never be an end to it? He had already lost his parents to the Raven. He had already lost the prince to whom he had sworn allegiance, sworn to protect at all costs. Even though Mythos' story had ended happily, had he still lost his closest friend to Drosselmeyer's story? Because the end, a fairy tale prince could not dwell in the everyday reality. Hadn't he already mastered the art of losing well enough? Losing further, losing faster? He wondered bitterly. But when all that rage had passed, the sorrow had stayed. He didn't know how long he sat at the window, gazing blindly. When he was shaking out of his stupor by a sudden, slight weight settling his arms, he looked down into Duck's worried blue eyes. She was watching him so intently he could see the reflection of his own tears in her eyes. Surely she must remember something of him, something of herself, to gaze at with concern. He buried his face in her feathers as he held her gently. Things only worsened over the next few weeks. Fakir could see Duck beginning to languish at living indoors, and often found her looking out the window as skeins of geese and ducks filled the sky, returning with the spring. She was even starting to go off her food a little. He supposed it was only natural since he was a wild duck, and not a domesticated one. She spent most of her life at the pond in the woods, not cooped up in some house. It broke his heart, but when spring finally arrived and the weather gentled, he went for a walk with her to the pond and paused by the store. Kneeling before her, he looked into her eyes and said a voice with only a slight quaver in it. Duck, you're free. He walked away without once looking back. As she watched the figure of her knight become smaller and smaller on the horizon, the little duck wanted to follow him. He meant so much for her for some reason that she could no longer remember. But thus the thought of being closed by the walls of that house made her feel trapped. She didn't think she could bear it. She felt so listless when all she had was a bathtub to swim in, its porcelain sides holding barely a puddle of water that tortured her with the taste of freedom. She would only waste away if she had to stay there any longer. And yet, she could feel her heart tremble with each step as her knight took away from her. Fakir returned to Duck's Pond every day. sitting on the pier from dawn to dusk with a writing pad on his knee, as he watched Duck idle around the supports of the pier, as if wanting her to be close to him. He spent as much time with her as he could. But now each hour, each minute, each second he spent together was haunted by the knowledge that she most not likely could remember him any more, and certainly didn't understand him any more than he could understand her. He felt like he was trying to love the memory of who Duck had been, but no longer was. Yet something of the girl he once knew must have remained, somewhere buried deep in her, and surely was some small memory of him, wasn't there? For her part, Duck was more overjoyed than she could express when she saw her knight come back the next day, and the next, and the next. She cried happily and spun the lying figures in the wire. She had been afraid he had abandoned her, but now she chided himself for doubting him. Somehow she felt that she should know better than to think he would break his promise. But what promise was that? He had made her a promise? She couldn't remember. Fakir wrote desperately now, trying to turn Duck back into a girl once more. But even so, he felt terribly conflicted about it. If she turned into a girl once more, would she regain all that she had lost in her time as a duck? Or that part of her mind was probably gone? Would she remember him if she were human once more? Would she still be the same duck he had known? The same vivacious girl who had befriended him in spite of himself? Or would she be someone else entirely? Would it be kinder to her to simply leave her as she was? Or did she even want to be a girl anymore? She didn't even remember being one. Could he write her back from memories? Did he even have that right? Was it fair to ask her to carry the painful memories of her past once more? The memories of having to give up her love, of having to sacrifice any chance of that love. Could all the good memories possibly compensate for the pain? Because he was so riddled with doubt, no matter how many pages he wrote, no matter how frantically he wrote, the words refused to come to life. They remained dead on the page. Charon noticed the gloom had begun to surround his son ever since his pet started to do poorly and let her go by the duck pond. Fakir was spending far too much time out there. Sensitive assessed it couldn't possibly be healthy. What was wrong with the boy? It was just a duck after all. Charon was at a loss. After all, Fakir was no longer a child, and would most likely bristle at anything he perceived as an invasion into his life. Not for the first time in his life. Charon couldn't decide what to do. One evening, as he watched back from Duck's Pond long after sunset, as morose as always, Fakir bumped into a swaying figure that seemed to be teetering about in empty nighttime streets of Goldcrown Town. As he helped the older woman up, it seemed he was still smiling and grinning widely, despite having been knocked to the ground. Suddenly, even though he knew it was irrational, he was furious with her. He was drowning in his own misery and hopelessness, in the bitterness that hand that fate had dealt with him. A hand, it seemed, that could not change even with his ability to spin tales into reality. He was losing a friend to a fate that was like a living death. He had foolishly thought Drosselmeyer merely meant that Duck would lose her human form for her animal one. She gave up the final heart shard. It was much worse than that. She was disappearing after all. Not in an incident, not in a flash of light, but slowly, day by day. The girl he knew was fading out of existence. How could the world continue as always? How could anyone, how could this woman, be happy when he was filled with so much misery that he felt pain could drown even the sun? Was this why, with an angry scowl, he snarled at her, "What the hell are you smiling about?" This merely elicited a giggle from the woman, even as her cave-worn face and empty eyes belied her smile. She slurred, "'Cause I've given up all my shadows." Her declaration was followed by a hiccup and another inane grin. With his words, his anger turned to intense jealousy. This woman had achieved all he wanted. Gripping her in his shoulders, holding her up, looking as much as his own legs were supporting her, he demanded, "How?" In response, she pointed vaguely behind her, then jerked herself out of his grip and almost instantly. Fakir followed the general directions he pointed in. At the end of the quiet street, he found a building that cast squares of light from its windows into the ground outside. He could hear it bustling within. A battered wooden sign read, "Lethe Tavern." Lethe, Fakir thought. The river of forgetfulness. Taking it as a good omen, he entered and joined the tables of drunken men and women. After all, he had always been nothing more than a coward, and worse than useless.